That wooden house had a secret. Before we start, folks, if this story touches your heart like it does mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. Your support means the world to us storytellers, and it helps us keep these tales alive for generations to come. Now, settle in with a cup of coffee, and let me take you back to a time when life moved a little slower. Well now, friend, pull up that old rocking chair there beside me, and let me tell you about something that happened way back in '89, when I was just a young buck of 22, fresh out of college, and dumber than a box of rocks when it came to real living. The sun setting just like it did that evening when I first laid eyes on the Whitmore place, and something about this golden light always brings me right back to that moment when my whole world got turned upside down. I'd driven my beat-up Ford pickup truck nearly 300 miles from Dallas, following a classified ad I'd torn out of the newspaper. Handyman needed for rural property. Room and board included. Must be willing to work hard and ask few questions. Now, looking back, that last part should have been a red flag bigger than Texas itself. But I was young and broke and tired of sleeping in my truck at rest stops. The Whitmore place sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to go on forever, winding through mesquite trees and rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. When I finally pulled up to that old wooden house, the first thing that struck me wasn't how weathered it looked, or how the paint was peeling off the front porch like old skin, or even how the screen door hung crooked on its hinges. No, sir, what got my attention was the silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes a man's ears ring, the kind you only find way out where civilization gives up and lets nature take over again. The house itself was something to behold, I'll give it that. 2 stories of weathered cedar and pine, with a wraparound porch that had seen better days, but still held the promise of lazy summer evenings. The roof was tin, the kind that sings when the rain hits it, and there were dormer windows poking out like sleepy eyes. But there was something about the place that felt, well, I guess the word would be expectant, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sat in my truck for a good 5 minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, just taking it all in. That's when I saw him emerge from around the back of the house. Samuel Whitmore was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same oak trees that dotted his property. Tall and lean, with silver hair that caught the light and hands that spoke of decades of honest work. His face was lined like a road map, each wrinkle telling a story of sun and wind and the kind of living that builds character in a man's bones. "You must be the young fellow who called about the job," he said, walking over with a gait that spoke of old injuries but unbroken spirit. His voice was like gravel in a creek bed, smooth but substantial. "Yes, sir, that'd be me. Jake Morrison." I climbed out of the truck and extended my hand, which he took in a grip that could have crushed walnuts. "Samuel Whitmore, welcome to my little piece of paradise." He gestured toward the house with obvious pride. "I suppose you're wondering what kind of work needs doing around here." Truth was, I was wondering about a lot more than that. The place had an odd feeling to it, like walking into a church or a library, somewhere that demanded a certain kind of respect. But I just nodded and said, "Yes, sir, I'm ready for whatever you need." Samuel studied me for a long moment, those pale blue eyes of his seeming to look right through to my soul. Finally, he nodded. "Well then, let's get you settled. We'll start fresh in the morning." He led me up onto that front porch, and I noticed how solid it felt under my boots despite its worn appearance. The front door was thick oak with glass panels that had been etched with some kind of pattern I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. Inside, the house was like stepping back in time 50 years. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but it all spoke of an earlier era when things were built to last and beauty meant something more than flash and convenience. The living room had hardwood floors so old they'd been polished smooth by generations of footsteps, and they creaked in a comfortable, homey way as we walked across them. There was a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig, with a mantel that held old photographs and a few books that looked like they'd been read so many times the covers had gone soft. The furniture was the kind your grandmother might have had, solid and comfortable, with doilies on the armrests and cushions that had been shaped by years of family gatherings. "Kitchen's through there," Samuel said, pointing toward a doorway. "Help yourself to whatever you find in the icebox. I eat simple around here, but there's always enough." He started up a staircase that curved along the wall like something out of a movie. Your room's up here, second door on the right. Bathroom's at the end of the hall. I'll be turning in soon, but we can talk business over coffee in the morning. My room was small, but comfortable, with a bed that had been made with military precision and a window that looked out over fields that seemed to go on forever. I could hear night sounds beginning outside, the kind of symphony that city folks never get to experience. Crickets and tree frogs, the distant lowing of cattle, and somewhere far off, a train whistle that spoke of journeys and possibilities. I unpacked my few belongings, which didn't take long, and then sat on the edge of the bed, trying to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. The ad had been vague, and Samuel hadn't exactly been forthcoming with details. But something about the place felt right, felt like maybe this was where I was supposed to be, even if I couldn't explain why. Sleep came easier than I'd expected, maybe because of the clean country air, or maybe because the bed was the most comfortable thing I'd experienced in months of truck stop living. I dreamed of horses running through tall grass and the sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere, just out of sight. Morning came with roosters crowing and the smell of bacon drifting up from downstairs. I found Samuel in the kitchen, which was everything you'd expect from a farmhouse built in the 30s. Cast iron stove, butcher block counters worn smooth with use, and windows that let in golden morning light that made everything look like a painting. He had coffee percolating in an old pot and was frying eggs in a skillet that probably weighed 20 pounds. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning around. "Better than I have in months, sir." He nodded approvingly. "This place has that effect on folks. Sit yourself down. We've got work to discuss." Over breakfast that was simple but better than anything I'd tasted in years, Samuel began to explain what he needed. The property was bigger than I'd realized, nearly 200 acres of rolling hills and woods, with a creek running through the middle and pastures that needed mending. There were outbuildings that needed repair, fences that needed fixing, and a dozen other projects that would keep a man busy for months. "The thing is," he said, looking at me seriously over his coffee cup, "this place has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built this house with his own hands back in 1892, and every generation since has added something to it, improved it, loved it. I'm the last Whitmore, and I'm not getting any younger. I need someone who will treat this place with the respect it deserves." I told him I understood, and I meant it. Even after just one night, I could feel the history soaked into the walls, the sense of family and continuity that comes with a place that's been home to generations of the same blood. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, and something in his tone made me pay closer attention. "This house, this land, it's got stories. Some of them you might find hard to believe. If you're going to stay here, you need to understand that there are things in this world that can't be explained with logic and reason. You strike me as the kind of young man who keeps an open mind, but I need to be sure." I wasn't quite sure what he meant by that, but I nodded anyway. I've always figured there's more to this world than what we can see on the surface. Samuel smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, and it transformed his whole face. "Good, then we'll get along just fine." And so began the most extraordinary chapter of my life. The first few weeks were straightforward enough. I repaired broken fence posts, cleared brush from overgrown paths, and fixed a leak in the barn roof that had been bothering Samuel for months. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that my college courses in business administration had never been. There's something about working with your hands, about fixing things and building things and making something better than it was, that feeds a part of the soul that most folks never even know is hungry. Samuel was good company when he chose to be, full of stories about the old days and wisdom that came from decades of living close to the land. He'd served in Vietnam, had been married to a woman named Eleanor who'd died 5 years earlier, and had raised 2 children who'd moved to California and rarely called. There was a sadness in him when he talked about his family, but also a kind of peace that comes with accepting life's disappointments without becoming bitter about them. The house itself continued to fascinate me. It was bigger than it looked from the outside, with rooms that seemed to serve no particular purpose and hallways that led to unexpected places. There was a library on the 2nd floor that was filled with books on subjects I'd never even heard of, philosophy and astronomy and history texts that went back centuries. The basement was cool and dry, with stone walls that had been quarried locally, and a ceiling supported by hand-hewn beams that were works of art in themselves. But it was the little things that really got my attention. Doors that would be standing open when I was sure I'd close them. Footsteps in the hallway at night when Samuel was fast asleep. The way certain rooms always felt like someone had just left them, as if you'd walked in on a conversation that had stopped the moment you appeared. I mentioned some of these things to Samuel one evening as we sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. He just nodded and rocked in his chair for a while before speaking. This house has seen a lot of living, son. 4 generations of births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, hopes and dreams and disappointments. Sometimes I think all that emotion, all that life, it leaves an impression on a place. Like how you can tell when someone's been in a room even after they've gone, just by the way the air feels different. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything he couldn't explain, and he was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. My great-grandfather, Jeremiah Whitmore, he was what folks used to call a peculiar man. Brilliant, mind you, but peculiar. He had interests that most people didn't understand, spent a lot of time studying things that weren't taught in any school. When he built this house, he built it according to principles that had nothing to do with conventional architecture. Samuel paused to light his pipe, the flame from the match casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. Jeremiah believed that a house should be more than just a shelter. He thought it should be a kind of, I guess you'd call a sanctuary, a place where the boundary between the everyday world and something deeper, something more meaningful, was a little thinner than usual. I felt a chill run down my spine, though the evening was warm. What kind of something deeper? That's what you're going to find out, son. Because I didn't hire you just to fix fences and repair roofs. This house chose you, just like it chose me, and my father before me, and his father before him. There's something here that needs tending, something that needs protecting, and it's time for you to learn what that is. The next morning, Samuel led me to a part of the house I'd never seen before. Behind the kitchen, hidden by what I'd assumed was just decorative paneling, was a door I'd never noticed. Samuel produced an old brass key from his pocket and unlocked it, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. Built into the hill, he explained as we descended by lantern light. Jeremiah had this excavated at the same time he was building the foundation for the house. Natural stone walls, perfectly dry, maintains a constant temperature year-round. The basement opened into a large chamber that took my breath away. The walls were lined with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was filled with books. But these weren't like the books in the upstairs library. These were old, some of them ancient, bound in leather that had been polished smooth by countless hands. The air smelled of old paper and binding glue and something else, something that reminded me of churches and ceremonies and things that were older than memory. In the center of the room was a large table made of some kind of dark wood I didn't recognize. Its surface was covered with maps and charts and documents that looked like they'd been drawn by hand. Around the edges of the room were glass cases filled with objects I couldn't begin to identify, things that looked like they belonged in a museum or maybe a magician's workshop. "Welcome to the real heart of the Whitmore place," Samuel said, setting his lantern on the table. "This is where the real work gets done." I walked slowly around the room, trying to take it all in. Some of the books were in English, but others were in languages I didn't recognize. There were star charts and what looked like architectural drawings and maps of places that didn't match anything I'd ever seen in an atlas. "What is all this?" I asked. Samuel pulled one of the books from a shelf and opened it carefully. The pages were covered with intricate diagrams and text that looked like it had been written with a quill pen. My great-grandfather was what some people might call a scholar of the unusual. He spent his life studying things that most folks don't believe in or don't want to think about. Ancient knowledge, forgotten wisdom, the kind of understanding that our ancestors took for granted, but that modern people have lost. He turned a few pages, showing me drawings that looked like architectural plans, but for buildings unlike anything I'd ever seen. Jeremiah discovered that certain places, certain pieces of land, have properties that make them special. They're like intersections, places where different kinds of reality come together. This property, this hill, has been one of those places for thousands of years. The Native Americans who lived here before us knew it. They built sacred sites here, held ceremonies, treated this ground with the respect it deserved. I was beginning to understand, though I wasn't sure I wanted to. When Jeremiah decided to build his house here, he didn't just want to put up a shelter. He wanted to create a structure that would work with the natural properties of the land, something that would preserve and protect what was already here while making it accessible to people who knew how to use it properly. Samuel closed the book and looked at me seriously. Every generation of my family has been the keeper of this place. We've maintained the knowledge, preserved the books, protected I guess you'd call it the sacred nature of this ground. And now it's time for someone new to take on that responsibility. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into depths I couldn't measure. Why me? I'm nobody special. I'm just a kid who needed a job. Samuel smiled. That's what my grandfather said when his father told him the same story. And what my father said when it was his turn. The house chooses, son. It draws the right person at the right time. You didn't answer that ad by accident, and you didn't drive 300 miles on a whim. You're here because this is where you're supposed to be. Over the following weeks, Samuel began my education in earnest. He taught me about the history of the land, about the Native American tribes who had considered it holy ground, and the early settlers who had been drawn to it for reasons they couldn't explain. He showed me how to read the old books, how to interpret the maps and charts, how to understand the careful notes that 4 generations of Whitmores had left for their successors. But more than that, he taught me to feel the land itself, to sense the currents of energy that flowed through it like underground rivers. On clear nights, we would walk out into the field and just stand quietly, learning to perceive things that had nothing to do with the 5 senses most people rely on. It's not magic, Samuel explained one evening as we stood on a hilltop watching the stars wheel overhead. At least, not the way most people think of magic. It's more like harmonics. Everything in the universe vibrates at its own frequency, and some places, some people are naturally tuned to pick up those vibrations. This land has been singing the same song for thousands of years. All we're doing is learning to hear the music. And gradually, incredibly, I did begin to hear it. Not with my ears, but with something deeper, something I'd never known I possessed. It started as just a feeling, a sense of rightness when I stood in certain spots or touched certain stones. But as the weeks passed, it became more distinct, more purposeful. I could sense the flow of underground water, could tell when storms were coming days before they appeared on the horizon, could feel the subtle changes in the earth's mood as the season shifted. The house itself became more responsive too, as if it recognized that I was beginning to understand its true nature. Doors that had been locked would open at my touch. Rooms that had seemed ordinary revealed hidden compartments and secret passages. And late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep, I would sometimes hear something that sounded like music drifting through the walls, melodies that seemed to come from the wood and stone themselves. It was in the 3rd month of my stay that I experienced what Samuel later told me was my true initiation. I've been working in the garden behind the house, trying to repair a stone wall that had been damaged by tree roots, when I noticed something odd about one of the stones. It was carved with symbols that looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. When I mentioned it to Samuel, his eyes lit up with excitement. "Show me," he said, and we walked out to the wall together. The stone was about the size of a dinner plate, and the symbols carved into its surface were definitely not random scratches. They looked deliberate, purposeful, like some kind of writing or maybe a map. "Well, I'll be damned," Samuel whispered, running his fingers over the carved surface. "Jeremiah's marker stone. We've been looking for this for 70 years. He explained that his great-grandfather had hidden several marker stones around the property, each one indicating the location of something important. Most have been found over the years, but this one, the most important one, had remained lost despite decades of searching. "What is a mark?" I asked. Samuel's grin was answer enough. That night, by the light of lanterns and flashlights, we carefully excavated around the stone. 3 feet down, our shovels hit something solid. It was a metal box about the size of a suitcase, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with wax. Inside, we found Jeremiah's private journal, the one that contained his most important discoveries. But more than that, we found detailed plans for something he called the heart chamber, a room built into the very bedrock beneath the house that served as a focal point for all the property's unusual energies. I always wondered why the basement felt different in that back corner, Samuel said as we pored over the drawings. But I never thought to look for a hidden entrance. It took us 3 days to find it. The entrance was behind a wall that looked like solid stone, but was actually a carefully constructed door that pivoted on hidden hinges. When we finally got it open, we found ourselves looking into a chamber that took both our breaths away. It was circular, about 20 feet across, with walls that had been carved directly out of the living rock. But what made it extraordinary was the way every surface was covered with symbols and carvings that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The floor was inlaid with different types of stone arranged in patterns that drew the eye inexorably toward the center, where a single chair sat waiting. "This is it," Samuel said softly. "This is what Jeremiah built everything else to protect. When I sat in that chair, everything changed. It was like suddenly being able to see colors that had no names, like hearing music that was composed of pure emotion rather than sound. I could feel the entire property around me, could sense every living thing from the smallest insect to the cattle grazing in the far pastures. But more than that, I could feel the connections that linked everything together, the invisible threads that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And I could feel the presence of everyone who had sat in that chair before me. Jeremiah, with his burning curiosity and fierce determination to understand the mysteries of existence. Samuel's grandfather, who had used the chamber to help his community through the Dust Bowl years by somehow calling rain when it was needed most. Samuel's father, who had sat here during World War II and somehow known, days before the official word came, exactly when his son would be coming home from overseas. "Every keeper of this place has added something to what came before," Samuel explained as I slowly came back to normal awareness. "Knowledge, understanding, purpose. The responsibility isn't just to preserve what's here, but to discover new ways to use it for good." And that's what I did for the next year and a half. I learned to use the heart chamber to monitor the weather patterns for hundreds of miles around, providing early warning of storms and droughts to farmers who had no idea where the information was coming from. I discovered that certain combinations of stones and symbols could purify water or encourage healing in plants and animals. I even learned to send what Samuel called good thoughts over long distances, somehow easing the loneliness of isolated people or comforting the sick. It was the most meaningful work I'd ever done, using abilities I'd never known I possessed to help people in ways they'd never understand. But it was also exhausting, and as time went on, I began to understand something that Samuel had been trying to prepare me for. "The house chooses its keeper," he said one evening as we sat on the front porch. "But it doesn't keep them forever. There comes a time when the work is done, when the person has learned what they needed to learn and given what they needed to give. And then it's time to move on and let someone else take their turn." I felt that time approaching as autumn gave way to winter. I'd learned everything Samuel could teach me, had added my own discoveries to the journals and maps in the basement library, had spent countless hours in the heart chamber deepening my understanding of the connections that bind all living things together. But I could feel something shifting, some inner compass pointing toward a different kind of journey. It was on a cold December morning that I found the newspaper ad that would change everything again. It was tucked into the classified section of a Dallas paper that someone had left at the diner in town, and it might as well have been written in neon letters for all the attention it grabbed. "Teacher needed for one-room schoolhouse in remote mountain community. Must be self-sufficient, creative, and committed to making a difference. Previous experience with unusual situations preferred." I showed it to Samuel, and he just nodded knowingly. "Colorado, I guess. There are places in those mountains that are almost as special as this one. Sounds like they need someone who understands that education is about more than just books and blackboards." We spent my last few weeks together preparing for the transition. Samuel had put word out through channels I didn't entirely understand, and sure enough, a week before I was scheduled to leave, a young woman named Maria showed up at the front door. She was a graduate student in anthropology who'd been having dreams about an old house in Texas. Dreams so vivid and persistent that she'd finally decided to pack up her car and go looking for it. I spent 3 days showing Maria everything I'd learned, just as Samuel had done for me. And when I watched her face light up the first time she sat in the heart chamber, I knew the house had chosen well once again. On my last morning at the Whitmore place, I packed my few belongings back into the same beat-up truck that had brought me there 2 years earlier. But I wasn't the same person who had answered that classified ad. I'd learned that the world is far more mysterious and wonderful than most people ever imagine. I'd discovered abilities within myself that I'd never dreamed existed. And most importantly, I'd learned that every person has a role to play in the great web of connections that holds everything together. Samuel walked me out to the truck, and we stood there for a moment, two men who had shared something that couldn't be put into words. "You'll do fine up there in those mountains," he said finally. "And someday, when you've learned what that place has to teach you, you'll move on again." That's how it works. We're all just temporary keepers of something much larger than ourselves. I drove away without looking back, because I knew that would only make it harder. But as I reached the end of that long dirt road and turned onto the highway, I could swear I heard something that sounded like music drifting on the wind behind me, a melody that spoke of gratitude and blessing and the promise that some connections never truly end. The mountain school turned out to be everything the ad had promised and more. 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, living in a community that had been cut off from the outside world by a landslide and was just beginning to rebuild its connections to civilization. They needed someone who could teach everything from basic reading to advanced mathematics, someone who could be part educator, part counselor, and part community organizer. But more than that, they needed someone who understood that learning is about more than just absorbing information. These children had grown up in a place where the boundary between the everyday world and something deeper was almost non-existent. They could sense things that city children never even notice, could feel the moods of animals and weather and growing things in ways that their previous teachers had tried to discourage as imagination or superstition. I spent 5 years in those mountains, and in many ways, they were the most rewarding years of my life. I taught those children to read and write in cipher, but I also taught them to trust their intuitions, to pay attention to the subtle messages that the natural world is always sending. I showed them how to use their unusual sensitivities not as something to be ashamed of, but as gifts that could make them better farmers, better healers, better neighbors to each other and to the land they lived on. And they taught me things too, about resilience and community and the kind of deep contentment that comes from living in harmony with your surroundings. About the way children can adapt to almost anything as long as they feel safe and valued. About the importance of preserving old knowledge while remaining open to new possibilities. But eventually, just as Samuel had predicted, I felt that inner compass shifting again. The children I'd started with had grown into capable young adults who no longer needed what I had to offer. The community had rebuilt its connections to the outside world and was ready for a teacher with more conventional credentials. And somewhere out there, I could sense there was another place, another group of people who needed someone with my particular combination of skills and experience. This time the call came not through a newspaper ad, but through a letter forwarded from the Whitmore place. A Native American reservation in Arizona was looking for someone to help establish a program that would preserve traditional ecological knowledge while also preparing young people for life in a modern world. They needed someone who understood that science and spirituality weren't opposite sides of a coin, but different aspects of the same truth. I spent the next chapter of my life working with tribal elders to document centuries of accumulated wisdom about sustainable agriculture, traditional medicine, and the kind of land management that works with natural systems instead of against them. We created educational programs that taught young people to value their heritage while also giving them the tools they needed to succeed in college or the job market. But we also did something more important than that. We created a bridge between the traditional knowledge that indigenous peoples have always possessed and the kind of scientific understanding that the mainstream world was finally beginning to recognize as valid. We showed that what some people call primitive superstition is often sophisticated environmental science that has been tested and refined over thousands of years. And through it all, I carried with me the lessons I'd learned in that old wooden house in Texas. The understanding that everything is connected, that every person and place and moment in time is part of a larger pattern that extends far beyond what we can see or measure. The knowledge that some things can only be learned through direct experience, through opening yourself to possibilities that can't be taught in any classroom or read in any book. The years passed, as years do, and I found myself moving from place to place, always following that inner guidance that had first led me to Samuel Whitmore's front door. I worked on an organic farm in Vermont where the soil seemed to respond to prayer as much as fertilizer. I spent a winter as caretaker of a lighthouse in Maine where the beam seemed to guide more than just ships safely to shore. I helped establish a meditation retreat in the California desert where people came to rediscover connections they'd lost to the noise and hurry of modern life. Each place taught me something new, added another piece to the puzzle of understanding that had begun in that basement library surrounded by ancient books and carefully preserved knowledge. And each place, in turn, was changed by what I brought to it. The accumulation of wisdom and experience that grows in a person who learns to pay attention to the deeper currents that flow beneath the surface of everyday life. But it wasn't until I was 47 years old that I finally understood the real purpose of my journey. I was working as a counselor at a school for troubled teenagers, kids who had been written off by the conventional education system as hopeless cases. Most of them came from broken homes, had histories of abuse or neglect, had learned to see the world as a hostile place where the only way to survive was to build walls around your heart and trust no one. What I discovered was that many of these kids had the same kind of sensitivity I'd first noticed in those mountain children, the same ability to perceive things that other people missed. But instead of being nurtured and valued, their gifts had been ignored or punished, twisted into sources of pain instead of strength. ISPE. Most of them came from broken homes, had histories of abuse or neglect, had learned to see the world as a hostile place where the only way to survive was to build walls around your heart and trust no one. What I discovered was that many of these kids had the same kind of sensitivity I'd first noticed in those mountain children, the same ability to perceive things that other people missed. But instead of being nurtured and valued, their gifts had been ignored or punished, twisted into sources of pain instead of strength. I spent 3 years at that school, working with one damaged child after another, teaching them that what they'd been told were weaknesses or mental problems were actually abilities that could be developed and used for good. I showed them how to shield themselves from negative emotions without closing their hearts entirely, how to use their intuitive insights to help rather than hurt, how to find meaning and purpose in a world that had shown them mostly cruelty and indifference. And slowly, incredibly, I watched those kids transform. The angry boy who'd been in and out of juvenile detention became a peer counselor who could defuse conflicts before they turned violent. The girl who'd been cutting herself learned to channel her emotional sensitivity into poetry that helped other troubled teens feel less alone. The kid who'd been labeled as having attention deficit disorder turned out to have an extraordinary ability to sense what people needed emotionally and became the kind of friend that everyone could turn to in a crisis. It was during my time at that school that I finally understood what Samuel had meant when he said that every keeper of special knowledge has to find their own way to use it for good. My gift wasn't just the ability to sense the connections between things or to work with the unusual energies that flow through certain places. My real gift was the ability to recognize those same capacities in other people and help them develop those abilities in healthy, positive ways. When I left the school, it was to establish something I'd been dreaming about for years. Using money I'd saved and a loan I secured by putting up the small cabin I'd bought in New Mexico as collateral, I purchased 50 acres of land in the foothills of the Rockies and began building what I called the Haven. It wasn't a school, exactly, and it wasn't a retreat center, though it had elements of both. It was a place where people who discovered they had unusual abilities could come to learn how to use them responsibly. where parents with gifted children could bring them for guidance instead of psychiatric medication, where adults who were struggling to understand experiences that didn't fit into conventional categories could find support and practical training. We never advertised, never promoted ourselves in any conventional way. Like the Whitmore place, the Haven drew the people who needed to find it. They came from all walks of life, all ages and backgrounds, but they all shared that same quality of sensitivity that I'd first recognized in myself during those early days in Samuel's basement library. Some stayed for a few weeks, just long enough to learn basic techniques for managing their abilities and integrating them into their everyday lives. Others remained for months or even years, becoming part of the teaching staff and helping to guide newcomers through their own processes of discovery and development. We taught meditation and energy work, but we also taught practical skills like organic gardening and sustainable building techniques. We studied ancient wisdom traditions, but we also stayed current with the latest research in psychology and neuroscience. Our goal was always to help people find the balance between honoring their gifts and living successfully in the regular world. And through it all, I kept in touch with a network of special places and people that had shaped my own journey. Samuel lived to be 89, and I was able to visit him several times before he passed, always finding him unchanged in the ways that mattered most, still sitting on that front porch at sunset, still radiating the kind of deep contentment that comes from a life lived in service to something greater than oneself. Maria, who had taken over as keeper of the Whitmore place, sent me regular updates on her own discoveries and the people who continued to find their way to that remarkable house. The mountain community in Colorado stayed in touch, sending me photographs of the children I'd taught as they grew up and started families of their own. The reservation in Arizona invited me back several times to participate in ceremonies honoring the work we'd done together. What I came to understand over all those years and all those places was that I'd been part of something much larger than any individual story. There's a network of people and places scattered all over the world, all working to preserve and share the kind of knowledge that our ancestors took for granted, but that modern civilization has largely forgotten. We're teachers and healers, guardians and guides, each one holding a piece of a larger puzzle that's been scattered by centuries of progress that forgot to account for the things that can't be measured or sold. We don't have meetings or membership cards, don't publish newsletters or maintain websites. We find each other through synchronicity and intuition, through the same mysterious forces that led me to answer that newspaper ad so many years ago. And we do our work quietly, one person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, trusting that the ripple effects will spread outward in ways we can't predict or control. Now, as I sit here on my own front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, I can feel the same sense of completion that I felt when I left each of the other places that shaped my journey. The Haven has served its purpose, has helped hundreds of people discover and develop their gifts, has sent them back into the world as healers and teachers and guardians in their own right. But more than that, it's taught me the final lesson that I think I was always meant to learn. The real secret isn't in any particular place or technique or piece of ancient knowledge. The real secret is an understanding that we're all connected, that every person we meet and every experience we have is part of a larger story that's been unfolding since the beginning of time. That wooden house in Texas, with all its mysteries and hidden chambers, was never really about the house at all. It was about learning to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the extraordinary in the everyday. It was about discovering that the most important magic isn't something you do, but something you become. Samuel Whitmore knew that when he hired a young drifter who needed more than just a job. He knew that the house would teach me what I needed to learn, and that I would carry those lessons out into the world where they were needed. Just like his great-grandfather had known when he built that place according to principles that had nothing to do with conventional architecture and everything to do with creating a space where transformation could happen. Every person who stayed at the Haven, every child I taught in those mountain schools, every troubled teenager who learned to see their sensitivity as a gift instead of a curse, has gone on to touch other lives in ways that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. And somewhere, right now, there's a young person sitting in their car outside a house or a school or a community center, answering a call they don't fully understand but know they have to follow. The network continues. The work goes on. The connections between all living things grow stronger with each person who learns to perceive them and honor them and use them for good. And that old wooden house in Texas, if it's still standing, is probably waiting right now for its next keeper, ready to share its secrets with someone else who needs to learn that the world is far more mysterious and wonderful than most people ever imagine. I've been many things in my life: a drifter, a handyman, a student of ancient wisdom, a teacher of children, a counselor of the troubled, a guardian of sacred knowledge. But most of all, I've been a witness to the miracle that happens when people open their hearts to possibilities that can't be explained or contained or sold, but only experienced and shared and passed along to the next generation. The sun's almost gone now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that remind me of that first evening at the Whitmore place. In a little while, I'll go inside and make myself some supper, maybe read a book or write a few pages in the journal I've been keeping for the past 30 years. Later tonight, I'll probably get a phone call from someone who's been having dreams about this place, someone who's ready for the next chapter of their own journey to begin. And tomorrow, or next week, or next month, I'll pack up my few belongings one more time and follow that inner compass toward whatever place needs what I've learned to give. Because that's how it works in this invisible network of helpers and healers and guardians of ancient wisdom. We go where we're called, we do what we're asked to do, and we trust that the larger pattern knows what it's doing even when we can't see more than a few steps ahead. The work is never finished because there are always more people who need to remember what they've forgotten, always more places that need tending, always more connections that need to be strengthened or repaired or newly discovered. But it's good work, meaningful work, the kind that feeds the soul even when it exhausts the body. And the best part is, you don't have to be special to be part of it. You don't need unusual abilities or years of training or access to ancient libraries full of mysterious books. You just need to be willing to pay attention, to trust your intuitions, to treat every person you meet and every place you go as if they might have something important to teach you. Because they do. Every single one of them. That's the real secret that wooden house was built to protect and preserve and pass along. Not some particular piece of knowledge or technique or power, but the understanding that the sacred is everywhere, just waiting for someone with eyes to see and ears to hear and a heart open enough to receive it. You want to know what happened to that house? Last I heard, it was still there, still drawing the right people at the right time, still serving its purpose as a place where transformation can happen. Maria passed the keeping of it along to a young man who'd been having dreams about stone chambers and hidden libraries, just like she'd dreamed of it years before she found her way to Samuel's front door. And someday, when that young man has learned what he needs to learn and given what he needs to give, he'll pass it along to someone else. The house will choose, just like it always has, just like it always will, because that's how the real magic works in this world. Not through spells or rituals or ancient formulas, but through the simple willingness to serve something larger than ourselves and trust that the story we're part of is worth telling. The stars are coming out now, same as they did on my first night at the Whitmore place, same as they have every night since the world began. And somewhere out there, under those same stars, there's probably a young person reading a classified ad or getting a phone call, or just feeling that restless stirring that means it's time to start looking for the place where their real life is waiting to begin. I hope they'll have the courage to answer that call, to pack up their belongings and drive down unknown roads toward possibilities they can't imagine. Because the world needs them, needs their particular gifts and perspectives and willingness to believe that there's more to life than what most people settle for. The network is always growing, always changing, always ready to welcome new members who are ready to discover that the most important journey isn't to any particular destination, but toward becoming the person you are always meant to be. And that, friend, is a journey that never really ends. Every day brings new opportunities to serve, new connections to discover, new ways to use whatever gifts you've been given to make the world a little bit better than you found it. That's the real secret that old wooden house was built to protect. Not that magic exists, but that we're all capable of it, if we just have the courage to believe in ourselves and the wisdom to use our abilities in service of love. So here's what I want you to remember when you're sitting on your own front porch someday, watching your own sunset, and thinking about the journey that brought you there. Every person you've ever met, every place you've ever been, every experience you've ever had has been preparing you for whatever comes next. The connections are already there, waiting to be discovered. The network is already functioning, ready to support you when you're ready to join it. All you have to do is pay attention, trust your heart, and be willing to follow wherever the path leads. Because somewhere out there, there's a place that needs exactly what you have to offer, people who need exactly what you've learned, a piece of the great work that only you can do. The sun's gone down now, and the night sounds are beginning. Crickets and tree frogs, the distant sound of wind in the pines, and maybe, if you listen carefully enough, something that sounds like music drifting on the breeze, a melody that speaks of gratitude and blessing and the promise that some stories are too important to ever really end. That wooden house had a secret, all right, but it wasn't hidden in any chamber or locked away in any library. It was written in the lives of everyone who ever found their way there, everyone who learned to see the world through different eyes and went back out into that world to share what they discovered. And now you know the secret too. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Well, folks, if this old story stirred something in your soul, if it reminded you that there's more magic in this world than most people ever dare to believe, then don't just sit there. Hit that subscribe button and give us a like. Let's build a community of people who understand that the most important stories are the ones that change how we see ourselves and our place in this beautiful, mysterious world. Share this tale with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been looking for permission to trust their own intuitions and follow their own path toward whatever's calling them. Because that's how the real magic spreads, one story at a time, one heart at a time, one person at a time, deciding to believe that they're part of something bigger and more wonderful than they ever imagined. Until next time, keep your eyes open for the extraordinary hiding in the ordinary. And remember, your own adventure is just a classified ad away.